Hi everyone, and welcome to Southasiasphere, Himal South Asian's monthly roundup of news events and developing stories across South Asia. I'm Raisa, and I'm joined by my colleagues Shubhanga, Malan, and Shweta. Hi guys!
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So, our big stories in this edition are how the Pandora Papers are being reported on in South Asia and the unfolding humanitarian and healthcare crisis in Afghanistan. In Around Southasia in 5 minutes, we're talking about how the military coup in Myanmar has impacted civil society organizations, Pakistan's startup scene, an evidence bill being presented in the Maldives impinging on freedom of expression, and the killing of a leading Rohingya activist in Bangladesh. Let's begin with the Pandora Papers.
As you all know, the Pandora Papers dominated all the headlines last week in the world and in South Asia. It was dubbed as one of the biggest leaks of financial documents that detailed the secret wealth and dealings of some 35 current and former leaders and a number of public officials. There were some South Asian governments who promised to probe the revelations. If you look at the investigation, the ICIJ or the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they were coordinating with simultaneous reporting from 150 media outlets in 117 countries. And they had started back in November 2020 to analyze the 11.9 million records. So, since most of the revelations have now become public knowledge, what we instead want to do in this podcast is to look at how it was discussed and reported in the region's mainstream media.
Malan, you've been looking at Pakistan, right? So how has the media been reporting the papers, in Pakistan?
Yeah, so in Pakistan, the ICIJ's partner was the News International. The reporting of the story across all media outlets was quite similar. Now, when the news broke, Prime Minister Imran Khan responded by saying that he had formed a high-powered cell to investigate the 700 Pakistani citizens named in the leaks. Now, since Khan was one of the first South Asian leaders to respond to the Pandora Papers, his statement was reported in almost all the major news outlets in the region. Some news articles also compared Imran Khan's reaction to the previous Panama Papers 5 years back, which saw his political rival Nawaz Sharif implicated. So most reporting pointed out the irony that out of the 700 who are named, some are closely linked to Khan, which includes members of his cabinet as well.
And what about India? They had quite a large number of people implicated as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the ICIJ's investigation linked to India by the Indian Express noted over 300 plus Indian names and the offshore holdings of over 60 prominent individuals, companies, former members of parliament, and government officials. So far, prominent Indian names revealed include Reliance ADAG's head Anil Ambani, cricketer Sachin Tendulkar, the sister of fugitive businessman Nirav Modi, and the husband of Biocon founder Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, with more names to be made public in the coming days. And meanwhile, the recent media coverage around the Pandora Papers in India centers around the government's promise to begin investigations into the leak. And according to a statement by the Finance Ministry, they've stated that because only a few Indian names have been named in the paper so far, the ministry said that the phased disclosures from the Pandora Papers appearing in the media will be monitored through a multi-agency group, and claimed that the government will be engaging with foreign jurisdictions to obtain relevant taxpayer information.
So there were a few interesting things in the Nepali press as well, which mostly focused around the 16 nationals whose name came up in the Pandora Papers, and the business groups that these people are associated with, and no politicians in the list of names. So the reporting itself was led by the Kathmandu-based non-profit Center for Investigative Journalism (CIJN), in collaboration with the ICIJ, and this is a model that CIJN has followed for last many years in doing some of the most important investigative stories in Nepal. often the reporters themselves are actually employees of other news organizations, which was also the case this time around. And the stories are produced by the CIJN and then published on their website, and then some other portals, republish them, presumably with their permission. So that was the model this time too. But what I found interesting was that Kantipur Daily, which is probably Nepal's largest circulating newspaper, they're also listed as a media partner from Nepal on the ICIJ website. But you wouldn't know that from just reading the reporting. So what's true is that some of their reporters were working with CIJN for this particular project, but there was nothing distinct about Kantipur's reporting itself, which was, limited to a story on the business section of the paper. On their website itself, along with that story, they linked a few stories from the CIJN website, a few more detailed pieces. So I found that interesting. But I think it also raises some important questions about, how much investment there is and what kind of infrastructures there are within the country's media's organizations for doing such work. Because if you need to rely on global collaborations, which are, by their nature occasional, how much, can you do stories that are much more national and where you don't have this kind of global support?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, Shubhanga. Now in Sri Lanka, news of the Pandora Papers was kind of met with indifference, and there were even people tweeting that powerful people being corrupt was hardly breaking news. There was also some discussion about how there was this factual error in the story written by the ICIJ staff on the date of origin of Sri Lanka's civil war, which is a bit of a doomed project to try to talk about the origin of conflict, because you could just keep going back in time. But this discussion did actually end up derailing talk about the actual contents of the report, which implicated a former MP and her husband, who are closely related to the Rajapaksas. I believe actually that Nirupama Rajapaksa is the president's niece.
Didn't Andrakumara Disanayaka also say something about their connection to the Rajapaksas in the parliament?
Yeah, he actually specifically mentioned the previous regime. So he mentioned both Basil Rajapaksa and UNP MP Ranil Wickremesinghe as well by name. And his comments, and where he basically spoke about their links to this couple, this was covered in the media. But it was quite telling that he actually played down the president's connection to the couple. I think it's a bit of an arbitrary distinction to make, to say, because they're all siblings. It's a bit silly to say that, one sibling is not as close to them as the rest. But there was also this very powerful editorial in the Daily FT, which highlighted public apathy towards corruption. And it spoke about how, when the previous government, the coalition government led by Maithripala Sirisena, when he didn't deliver, members of the Rajapaksa family were actually voted in again in 2019, despite being unseated in 2015 due to corruption. So it kind of shows that people have short-term memories when it comes to these issues, even though they, turn elections. And the state-run Daily News actually focused on the president's order to the Bribery Commission to conduct an investigation into the allegations made by Pandora Papers. But on Twitter, there were several people who pointed out, including the former Human Rights Commissioner, that the president should be able to order supposedly independent commission to conduct investigations.
Yeah.
And some of them even said that appealing to the commission was just another way to bypass judicial process. And they pointed to a long history of government commissions with no consequences for wrongdoers as evidence for that. But meanwhile, there's a humanitarian and health crisis unfolding in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. Shweta, could you give us the latest on that?
Sure, Raisa. So, international aid groups have warned that the healthcare system in Afghanistan is on the edge of collapse. With thousands of healthcare facilities, they've run out of essential medicines, and Afghan doctors haven't been paid in months. Now, after the Taliban takeover, the country has been plunged into an economic and financial crisis, international donors, including World Bank, EU, and IMF, froze fundings for new projects, including $600 million in healthcare aid. And the Biden administration has also frozen Afghanistan's central bank assets that are held in the US. While the US is granting 2 licenses allowing various groups to provide humanitarian assistance to the country, without access to foreign reserves and funds, the interim government in Kabul can't finance vital food imports. And given that recognition from the international community seems elusive at the moment, this crisis indicates just how quickly basic services can unravel as international donors struggle with distributing aid without placing funds in the hands of the Taliban. And this is happening while 18 million Afghans, more than half the population in the country, are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, and I think this question of international recognition, continues to be a significant hurdle, even though the Taliban government has been making some attempts to kind of address that. So in late September, they actually sought a seat at the UN's General Assembly, which was eventually turned down. What's interesting is that over the last few years, Taliban has had a pretty thick engagement with various governments around the world as part of their talks in Doha. And some of this, even included trips to places like Uzbekistan, Iran, Russia, Turkmenistan, China, and Pakistan. But all the governments, it seems, including those that they were dealing closely with, are much more cautious now and will, likely significantly impede their efforts to raise funds.
Right, and actually, this kind of topic of, international recognition and the impact of sanctions was actually part of this discussion which happened at a webinar which was held recently, organized by the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. And it included panelists from Afghan civil society who are still in Kabul. So Mahbooba Siraj from the Afghan Women Network spoke very powerfully about how the country was on a fast train to destruction, she called it, due to this just lack of urgency in recognizing this rapidly emerging humanitarian crisis due to a lack of funds. And she said there needed to be a distinction drawn between money released for governance and money released in order to meet the urgent needs of civilians, including for food and medicine. She also condemned countries like Pakistan and more recently Tajikistan for allowing, geopolitical considerations to prevail even during this unfolding crisis. There was also some very interesting insight from the former urban advisor to Afghanistan from India, Pushpa Pathak, who kind of gave an overview of how humanitarian aid decreased since 2009 as foreign troops' presence decreased on the ground. And she also spoke about how so far there's been about $1.2 billion pledged for humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. But there's a lot of skepticism about how that money is going to actually reach people in need of urgent assistance, and in fact whether they'll even be able to reach people, and how that money is going to be used. So in this sense, she actually said that South Asian civil society has a role to play in advocating for continued funding to reach people in urgent need, irrespective of the government in place. And now moving on to our next segment, Around Southasia in 5 minutes.
Thanks, Raisa. So let's start with Myanmar, where the civil society is going through a period of serious crisis, as was expected after many months of crackdown by the military government. A recent survey of civil society groups in the country actually found that nearly 1/5 of the surveyed groups had closed down and 16% had suspended their activities, which basically means that, civic society activities have shrunk by over a third. Of course, the situation is much worse for people and individuals working on democracy and civil liberties. Over 100 of their members are in military detention at the moment. And further restrictions in law and more surveillance is also expected. One interesting point that I read from a recent report is that while civil society groups have been involved in health, social services, educational sectors, basically kind of activities seen as being apolitical, even during the military regime. It seems that the military is keen on institutions like the monasteries to be more involved in these service provisions.
Over in Bangladesh, one of the most well-known community leaders to highlight the suffering of Rohingya refugees, teacher and activist Mohibullah, was killed in a camp in Cox's Bazar on September 29th. The Bangladeshi government has so far arrested 5 Rohingya in connection with the killing, and they've said they were probing links to an armed group. Now, Mohibullah's family has said that they believe the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which is a group behind several attacks in Myanmar, to be behind the killing, as they were enraged by his growing popularity. And they've also said they've received death threats for identifying Arsa as the potential killers. Meanwhile, this group actually contends that it was unidentified criminals who were responsible.
So there's some good news from Pakistani tech industry that is experiencing exponential growth in 2021. So far, Pakistani startups have secured at least $240 million in investment in 2021 alone, compared to the 66 million raised in 2020. Now, among the startups, there is Bazaar, a B2B online platform for grocery store owners of Karachi, Creditbook, an app to help small businesses digitize their bookkeeping, and Abi, an online platform that allows employees to access their earned wages before their payroll date. While this is good news, it will be interesting to see how this will unfold and what the future of Pakistani tech will be, especially given that some of the global tech giants threatened to leave Pakistan over new regulations on social media and the internet just last year.
Over in the Maldives, on the 28th of September, journalist organizations and NGOs in the Maldives issued a statement calling for authorities to drop new provisions of the proposed evidence bill, which is currently being debated in Parliament. The provisions in the Article 136 of the evidence bill would empower courts to demand journalists and media outlets to reveal their sources if the court determines that the public interest of revealing a journalist's source outweighs the negative impact to the sources. Now, the statement noted that the vague language of the proposed provisions also leaves room for intimidation and harassment of journalists and their sources, who will be deterred from speaking the truth. And now it's time for a culture segment, Bookmarked.
Thanks, Shweta. And let's begin with a bit of good news for journalists around the world, but especially 2 journalists, Maria Ressa, founder of the news website Rappler, which is based in Philippines, and Dmitry Muratov, who's the editor of Novaya Gazeta, a newspaper based in Russia. The 2 were awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace last week, and I quote, for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. That's according to the Nobel Committee. But I think it's a great news for it's great news that the Nobel Committee recognized working journalists, particularly those working in independent media outfits, places that kind of focus on investigative reporting and scrutinize their governments. And it's also worth noting that the Norwegian politician that nominated Maria Ressa mentioned that she was both a symbol and representative of thousands of journalists around the world. So I think it's a great news, especially following the solid reporting we saw after the Pandora Papers.
Yeah. So if you guys haven't been living under a rock for the last few months, you would have surely heard Manike Mage Hithe by Yohani. Now, currently the song is taking the world by a storm. The song has nearly 150 million views on YouTube. It has been covered 1 million times by other singers from around the region. I think I first came across Yohani when she covered Pana Senhasa by Dushyant Veeraman, which is one of my favorite songs. And I think it was a cover of Drill Team's Devyange Bare, which kind of put her on the radar, especially her rap in it. So what do you guys think?
My own feeling was that it's and maybe why it might have been so popular is that it's a nice, simple, kind of memorable tune. I don't know the lyrics, so you guys can say more about it. But what I do know is I regret not doing a Nepali language version of it and missing the boat on some global popularity. So
yeah, I think like you said, Marlon, it was her cover of Drill Team which kind of made her gain some kind of recognition within Sri Lanka, like before Manike Mage Hithe went viral, because people realized that she could rap, and I think she got this nickname of Rap Princess after that song kind of went viral. But at the same time, and this is something we see that in general with women who take up, space as public figures, even as she got more popular, she also faced a lot of like online harassment, which she also talks and sings about, in her debut single, Aye, after she had signed with a new record label. She actually specifically raps about how, the focus was not on her rap and her music, but, rumors that her nudes were being leaked, that this is what people were interested in, and this kind of online harassment and bullying. Unfortunately, we see it a lot with women who are, and especially women celebrities. So yeah, that was unfortunate. But at least she's, gotten some, now she's gotten some positive attention, and she's, traveling, touring in India, and even voicing a Bollywood song, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I saw her recently with one of the Bollywood stars.
Salman Khan.
Salman Khan? Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And I first came across her cover on TikTok, where there have been hundreds of covers of these songs in all kinds of South Asian languages, from Tamil, Malayalam, Nepali, Bangla, and even Divehi. Do you guys have a favorite cover of the song?
I can't say that I have a favorite cover. I kind of just like that everyone's taking it and doing their own language version, like you said, Shweta.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. Although, actually, there has been a parody which has been imitating several of our politicians singing it, which is kind of funny.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah. Oh, that went
pretty
viral.
cool.
Like, there's one, I think it's basically the president, the prime minister, and Ranil, if I'm not wrong, who are like singing it. So that was quite funny. But yeah, I guess that would be my favorite.
Yeah. So I actually know, again, favorite cover. So if Shubhanga had done a cover, I think by default that would have been our favorite cover, like forever. So, but I love the Rowdy Baby mashup that was done. That was superb. I don't know whether you guys came across that.
Yeah, I heard that one was got a lot of traction as well.
Yeah. So I have a question for you guys. So from Sri Lanka, who would you bet to go viral next out of our current crop of artists?
Oh, out of artists. I mean, when you say viral, the most, it's really difficult to predict, because the wildest things, like our politicians say the wildest things, so it could literally be anything.
Yeah. I think we've been viral so many times, our parliament. Remember the book throwing incident?
Yeah, we've been viral so many times. Most recently, I guess, for just like food emergency and things like that, but also for like absolutely insane things that happen here.
So I mean artists. So let's
from Sri Lanka's current crop of artists. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to say that it would be another Sri Lankan artist that would like get a lot of traction in a positive way.
Okay, let me throw some names around. How about Omaria?
I mean, that would be awesome. I love her voice.
Yeah.
Her voice is great. But we do have a lot of like talented rappers who have been kind of, their songs have been getting some attention within Sri Lanka. I personally really like Drill Team. Their lyrics aren't always, the most, but they rap about a lot of like interesting like social issues. Like Yohani covered Devyange Bare, which is one of their songs, which talks about gambling and debt. I kind of like Jayamadhanapura Venuma, which I listen to whenever after I read the news. That's my go-to song to just listen to channel the frustration. And there's quite a lot of songs like that, which from like new artists who kind of speak about a similar frustration with corruption and things, which I think are really good. So I would like for them to go viral, you know. It would be cool if people went and like explored Sri Lankan music after Yohani. And actually there was this post that went viral saying, which was like a comment on another musician, I think Ridma Veeravardhana's music video, saying, "Hi, I'm from India and I'm here after watching Manike Mage Hithe." So people are like, oh, will people like try to explore different artists after this? That would be really cool if, you know, more of our artists got attention after this. So we'll see.
Shall we move on to our recommendations?
Yeah.
So my recommendation this month is an interesting paper by this historian from Berkeley called Vanessa Ogle, who's written a paper on, well, she's been working on what she calls offshore capitalism. So basically the history of the creation of these tax havens that have been in news so much, you know, last several weeks. It's a paper called Funk Money: The End of Empires, the Expansion of Tax Havens, and Decolonization as an Economic and Financial Event. So basically what she's doing is she's kind of looking at how, you know, in the years, kind of in the decades following decolonization, there was a kind of money panic among largely white settlers, businessmen, and officials that had investment in the colonies, and that were distrustful of the newly kind of independent nations. So they started to liquidate their assets and move, you know, the capital out of the colonial world, which then she argues is kind of linked to the creation or expansion of some of these tax havens. So what we're seeing today is actually in some ways a continuation of a longer kind of post 1950s, 1960s history. So I think that's an interesting thing to read right now.
Yeah, my recommendation would be Scratches on Celluloid, which is directed by Vindhya Bodhpitiya and Timothy Cooper. It's a film which looks at cinema halls in Lahore and Jaffna as spaces of resilience amid insurgency, war, and infrastructural breakdown. What I found particularly interesting about it is that, I didn't realize how these smaller cinemas kind of continued even during the worst of Sri Lanka's kind of civil war. But what I found really interesting was how there was this exchange between, actors and actresses between Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and how, they would, Sri Lankans would often fly to Pakistan and vice versa and shoot films here to kind of have a different backdrop for their movies, which I didn't know, and I found that really interesting. So if you're interested in cinema, I would suggest checking that out.
And my recommendation for this month is anthropologist Nanika Mathur's new book titled Crooked Cats, Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene. She builds on 15 years of research across India, and she locates a series of multi-species encounters to ask new questions about how stories of crooked cats, which is a term she uses for big cats that prey on humans, or rather cats that have gone off the straight path. She uses these stories to kind of deepen our understanding of the climate crisis and opens out the debates on the Anthropocene. Because often scientific work dictates how we understand human-animal relations, and the increase in what is kind of problematically termed human-animal conflict has taken a particular form, with policy and conservationist voices taking a lead in it. What this book does is it presents a different story by engaging with knowledge practices that are kind of usually kept separate from one another, and explores what happens to our understanding of human and big cat relationships, and also broader subjects like species extinction and the climate crisis when we center voices and narratives that are ignored in discussions about the future of life on Earth. So I highly recommend this book because it's not only a timely read, but it's a really kind of sharp and creative piece of ethnographic writing.
That's great, Shweta. And on that note, that's it for this edition of Southasiasphere. Do head to our website, himalmag.com, to see more of Himal's work. And while you're at it, check out our membership plans and support us. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye.